Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world, in Canada or North America, or maybe other places too. My name is Gillian Maxwell. I'm a founding board member of the Psychedelic Association of Canada, and I welcome you to our discussion on psilocybin, access to psilocybin in Oregon State, where that is at, how that came about in the first place, and of course, what that means for our processes in Canada. I'm going to, I think I've told you about myself. I'm a board member. I'm very passionate about drug policy reform, and particularly in psychedelics, because just the amount of beneficial use for people for many, many reasons. And that's why I'm here, I think, in this lifetime. And I also run and operate a retreat center in the Kootenays called the Sentinel. I'm delighted to introduce to you my colleagues and friends and panel members, and they're going to just have a small moment or two to introduce themselves. But before they do that, I just want to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory. Excuse me, I'm in British Columbia right now, so I'll just stick with where I am at the moment. And I acknowledge the Musqueam, the Coast Salish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And over to you, Mark Haden. Please tell us who you are.
Mark Haden. I spent my first career working in the addictions world, the Addiction Services, Vancouver Coastal Health. I ended that part of my life and started MAPS Canada, ran that for 10 years, do a bit of a teaching thing out at UBC, periodically write some papers here and there, and now I work for a couple of different companies, all doing the psychedelics.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mark. Over to Dr. Pam Kryskow.
Thanks, Gillian, and wonderful to be here. I am one of the founding board members of the Psychedelic Association of Canada. I am a medical doctor and the medical lead on the nonprofit Roots to Thrive, which is psychedelic-assisted therapy. And I have academic appointments at University of British Columbia and Vancouver Island University. And we're about to launch the first accredited psychedelic-assisted therapy program. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Pam. Welcome. And coming up now, Daniel Abrahamson is going to introduce himself. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm Dan Abrahamson, and I'm an attorney in the United States. And for 20-some years, I was the legal director of the Drug Policy Alliance, working on drug policy reform issues around the United States and in other countries. And in the last few years, have been consulting with various organizations and individuals on criminal justice reform and drug policy reform. And since 2020, have been working with various organizations and individuals in the state of Oregon, which you'll be hearing more about in a moment, around psilocybin issues. So that's one of the things I'm working on now.
Great, thank you. So that's our wonderful panel, and we're here to talk about access to psilocybin and where it's at. And so we're going to start with Oregon, and it's actually went way, way back, but certainly 1.5 years ago, there was a ballot initiative which was successful, and therefore things have been put into place as a result of that. And I'm going to go back to Daniel to explain what a ballot initiative is for us in Canada that don't know those things, and then where it has taken Oregon.
Thanks again, Gillian. In the United States, as you all know, there are 50 United States and the federal government, and states have their own laws and the federal government has its own laws. And sometimes those laws overlap and sometimes those jurisdictions have very different laws. And in 16 of the United States, there is a process by which the voters themselves can choose which laws to have put on the books through the initiative process. So in all the states, we have legislatures where the elected legislators meet and pass laws. But in 16 of those states, not only is there legislatures can make laws, but the people themselves can make the laws directly through the initiative process, where they get to vote on it. And typically a majority is enough to pass a law in those 16 states that have the initiative process. Oregon is one of those states. that has the initiative process. Many of you might have been familiar with California's initiative process because back in 1996, California was the first of the United States to pass something called medical marijuana that then triggered an avalanche of medical marijuana laws sweeping across the United States, first in those states that had the initiative process and then through the traditional legislative process. Flash forward to 2020, November 2020, Oregon becomes the first state in the United States to pass psilocybin law that allows therapeutic access to psilocybin. And the voters passed that by, I think, a very wide margin. I forget the exact number, 58% or above, I believe. And that's what the voters did in November of 2020. They actually passed two initiatives the same day in November of 2020, Measure 109, the Psilocybin Services Act, which I'll describe in a bit more detail, and then Measure 110, which decriminalized personal use and possession of drugs. And so Oregon did two things, the first of its kind of any state in the United States, decriminalization of drugs and actual legalization and regulation of psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. So that is, in a nutshell, some of the power that an initiative process can provide voters, especially with respect to drug policy reform. With respect to Measure 109, the Psilocybin Services Act, it said that anyone over the age of 21 in Oregon, starting when the program starts in 2023, can lawfully seek and access psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. A person 21 years or older does not need to have a medical condition, does not need to have a medical recommendation. They simply need to be able to go to a state licensed service center, present themselves, answer screening questions to make sure that they will not be harmed by taking psilocybin. And then assuming they pass the screening, they will then be eligible to receive a dose of psilocybin and have their journey at the service center overseen by what you and I and many of us would call a guide, but Oregon uses the term facilitator. Facilitator is somebody who in Oregon will be trained as a facilitator, who must graduate from a facilitator training program. That program must be approved by the state as a legitimate training program that can impart the type of information that a facilitator would need to have. And that facilitator will then need to take an exam provided by the state of Oregon and pass that exam and then become licensed as a facilitator before they're able to work at one of these licensed service centers in order to help facilitate a person's psilocybin journey for therapeutic purposes. So that in a nutshell is what Oregon voters passed in November of 2020. And what they said is, and they understood this, that we're the first jurisdiction in the world to do this. And we need a couple years of ramp up time to figure out how to put all of those pieces together, how to put in and create facilitator training, how to create and stand up these service centers where these services will be provided, and how to set the rules and regulations around who can grow the psilocybin that will be used within this tight container of a structure in Oregon, how that product will be tested for purity and potency, how it will be packaged and labeled, and how it will be transported to these service centers for later use. So they said, we're giving ourselves 2 years to figure all that out, and bang and go. And since January of 2021, the governor has appointed a psilocybin advisory board of people with committees and subcommittees to help answer all these questions and help the state write the rules and regulations to make this program go. We are a little more than 6 months from 2023 when this program is supposed to be launched, and things are relatively on track. And so I'm going to pause there for a second with that very general high-level overview and ask my co-panelists whether they have any specific questions regarding that level of overview that I can add to. Otherwise, I can start diving into some particularities, but let me pause for a second. Anything else in terms of the general scope? Okay, hearing no
So,
question.
sir, just
Go ahead.
I want to be clear for a second. So you can't go in and buy psilocybin, but you can access psilocybin services.
That is correct. This is unlike a medical marijuana or an adult use marijuana law, which are now prevalent throughout the United States, where in the marijuana context, you can go to a cannabis dispensary of some sort, purchase the product that you desire, and walk out with it and use it somewhere else, typically in your own personal space. That is not what Oregon is doing with psilocybin. Oregon says the only way under Oregon law you can lawfully access psilocybin, which is still illegal under federal law, I should make that clear. Oregon, under its state law, said we are not going to penalize this therapeutic use. The only way you can do this lawfully in Oregon is to go to a service center, be approved as a client, and then use the psilocybin on the premises of that service center under the guidance of a licensed facilitator. So there is no taking the psilocybin away from the service center or off property and using it on your own time.
I would also be curious about the credentialing or who is being trained as facilitators.
That is excellent question. Thank you, Mark. So this is a little bit more of a controversial part of Oregon's law as seen from the outside. Not yet controversial within Oregon, but other people have questioned this. Under Oregon law, under the Psilocybin Services Act, anybody with a high school degree is eligible to seek training from an approved training program to become a licensed facilitator. So a licensed facilitator in Oregon, and we have none yet in Oregon because these programs have yet to be finally and fully approved and start their training process. But in theory, anybody with a high school degree can become a facilitator upon passage of their curriculum and then passage of the state licensing exam. You do not need a special degree in mental health, medicine, social services, or what have you. You just have to have done well and passed your curriculum in this training program. So the potential universe of facilitators in Oregon is going to be pretty broad, it seems. That's how the law is written.
I'm still bustling with questions here. So,
yes.
And what's the relationship between this service you just described and the for-profit medical system and the not-for-profit medical system?
I might have to ask you a question by what you mean by not-for-profit and for-profit medical system, because in the United States, we've got a very different medical system as Canada does. These service centers and the facilitators themselves, most of them, to my understanding, are going to be set up as for-profit centers. Doesn't mean some of them could certainly choose to pursue a nonprofit path, but this isn't being conceptualized in a nonprofit or profit-making sphere, although it's assumed that most of these business entities, and they are business entities, are going to be there for profit, which raises issues about access and equity and cost and the ability of people with relatively little income to actually access services that they have to pay for. And that's going to be a tension because the Oregon law makes very clear that one of the goals of the Oregon scheme is to have equitable and widespread access to psilocybin therapy. Because the program has yet to start, we don't know if that equitable access is going to be delivered on and in what way or in what ways it's going to fall short, because nothing has begun yet.
Are the HMOs stepping up and saying we want to embed this within our services?
Yeah, so so now that question gets to the corporate organized medical establishment. And that the answer to your question is very clear right now, which is because psilocybin is illegal under federal law, there is no way to have psilocybin services reimbursed by private or public insurers in the United States. And so at this point, the hospital systems and medical and health systems of Oregon or anywhere else in the United States are sitting on the sidelines and watching quietly and wondering when the larger law will change and how they can perhaps get involved and whether they should get involved in the scheme. But at this point, they are totally on the sidelines because it's illegal for them to dabble with psilocybin, which is an illegal substance under federal law. So, so to become someone who's engaged with service centers, or to be growing and packaging psilocybin under a state license, or to be a facilitator who actually handles psilocybin, if they do at the service center, is someone who is a resident of Oregon who's willing to take a risk that what they're doing is illegal under federal law, and they could be exposed to criminal liability under federal law, just not state law. So those are all legal risks, but that is the same as the case. Same is true in the marijuana and medical marijuana sphere in the United States. Anybody who engages in those activities also faces potential federal exposure.
Let me jump in, Daniel. I have a question about this. So you said that people will then get their psilocybin from their service center. They will imbibe it there. So what happens with folks that are microdosing? They have to show up at their service center every single day that they want to microdose and take their microdose and then go home?
That's an excellent question, Pam. The issue of microdosing is one that was not particularly on the radar screen of the state or the voters when they passed this, and was really not on the radar screen of the Psilocybin Advisory Board during their first 6 months of meetings. It is now on their radar screen, and so these discussions of how to address microdosing through this scheme are beginning to be had. But there has been no resolution on the microdosing issue of whether the rules somehow need to be changed so that you don't require people to show up every day to the service center, whether there needs to be a separate set of regulations for microdosing, or whether microdosing will really be better covered under Measure 110, which I alluded to before, which is the simple decriminalization of personal possession, in which case you microdose, you do it outside the whole scheme of Measure 109, and you call it a day and saying the cops aren't going to pay attention to me because of Measure 110. So the issue of microdosing is an unresolved one. And a lot of people are hoping there will be clarity and a more of a pathway towards more overt, open, and above board microdosing, but that hasn't happened yet, and it's not been the main course of the conversation with respect to Measure 109, which is setting up for non-microdosing purposes these service centers. So
I'm bursting with questions here. So if I was a client or a normal human, regular, healthy, normal person who wanted to have an experience, I didn't know anything about psilocybin, and I said, please give me an experience, what dosage would I get?
Also unclear at this point. It would really be open. It's a conversation to be had between you and your facilitator at the service center about what are your goals, what are your backgrounds, what are some possible contraindications in your background, what is your previous experience with psilocybin or other psychedelic drugs, and then that conversation would ensue, and the facilitator would have a range of options to provide you. I believe there is an upper dose limit. I honestly, and I apologize for not knowing that limit off the top of my head, but below that limit, it could be a whole range of things, depending on whether it's your first visit to this service center or a subsequent visit, but it's really a conversation between you and your facilitator and what the facilitator believes based on their training and experience is appropriate.
Right.
Are the qualifications for two questions here. One, have the qualifications for who will, for that training been set, or is that part of the education committee still working on that? And two, have the qualifications for what will qualify as a service center been set yet, or is that also still in committee?
So with respect to the training of facilitators by facilitator training programs, the rules for what it takes to run a training program and be approved by the state to be a training program, those were set about 6 weeks ago and finalized. As of about 2.5 weeks ago, for prospective facilitated training programs had the opportunity to begin applying to the state to become approved training programs by filling out an application saying, these are all of the ways that we meet the state's requirements for being able to adequately train our facilitators. We will cover these 23 aspects of substantive curricula that students need to know. We promise to provide this number of hours of classroom training. We promise to provide at least minimum this number of hours of practicum training, etc. So the state has set out the guidelines that programs need to reach to become approved training programs.
Is an experience required?
And then 4 programs have been approved by the Oregon Health Authority thus far, but there has one more, another state agency that has to approve them as well. So there's a 2-step hurdle process for these programs. So far, 4 have passed the first step. Sorry, Mark?
Is an experience required? Is it possible for a facilitator to be never having tried them themselves?
The board, there's a general desire and an understanding that a facilitator should have personal experience to become, in order to be a proper, adequately trained facilitator. But this is an egg and chicken problem of no other jurisdiction in the world really allowing this to happen. And so how do the first generation of facilitators lawfully get experienced? So Oregon, understanding that they have this chicken and egg problem, said, at least for the moment, we're not going to require this first generation of facilitators to have personal experience in order to receive their license. We encourage facilitators to dabble with or experience altered states, not through illegal drugs, whether it's through breathing, meditation, other ways of experiencing an altered state. But that is a sort of a fudge that was written to account for this chicken and egg problem of this first generation training. After the law goes into effect and service centers are up and running, student facilitators will have plenty of opportunity to have a personal experience. And so that's one of these growth things that you had, and similar, and that goes to the medical marijuana. Where do you get that first seed in state in order to start a cannabis dispensary? Well, it had to come from somewhere. We're just not going to ask too closely where it came from. I suspect that's what's going to happen with this first generation of facilitators who are going to get licensed.
I have a couple of questions from the audience here, Dan. You may have answered this, but are there any limitations on who can apply to become a service center? And this previous person was asking about a religious community, that kind of thing.
And I haven't answered Pam's second question about service centers, but I can answer some of them all together. But so as I said, the rules for training programs have been established and training programs are in the process of getting approved. The rules for service centers have yet to be finally written, and those will come online later this year. And when those come online, service centers themselves will begin applying for licensing by the state, but they can't apply for licensing yet because the rules aren't set yet, which goes to the other question from the audience member of, are there rules about what it takes to become a service center? And one of the rules about running a service center is it has to be majority owned by persons who live in Oregon, who are Oregon residents. So there is a residency requirement to keep some of this money homegrown, and to a little bit of favoritism in terms of favoring residents of Oregon in this, what is first of its kind, new business and new business model. So with that aside, other than residency requirement, there's going to be lots of requirements to run a service center around where can it be located within a community? What type of security measures does it have to have? What types of people and skills of those people does it have to employ? So there's going to be a variety of requirements of what it takes to run a service center. Those have been discussed by the committees. There's been lots of proposals, but those rules have yet to be solidified. So that's the short answer to that question. The last thing I think, Gillian, you asked about, or the audience member asked about, was religious use. And that's been a side discussion as well of whether this whole therapeutic psilocybin framework, how does that mesh or not mesh with sacramental use of psilocybin? And the answer in my mind, not everyone's mind, but the answer in my mind is fairly clear in the sense that what was presented to voters was a therapeutic psilocybin scheme, which said nothing about sacramental use. And so when the voters passed Measure 109, they were not addressing sacramental use whatsoever. And so it's a little bit of an apples and oranges type of thing. There is a concerted effort to try to take the scheme passed by Oregon voters and insert sacramental use into that. That was rejected by the Attorney General, the Department of Justice of Oregon. They looked at this attempt to incorporate sacramental use and said, you know, that's not what this law is about. That's not what the voters were speaking about. And so this is not a yay or nay, or up and down, or approve or disapprove of sacramental use. It's just not part of this discussion. You can have the sacramental use discussion in a different form, in a different way, but not in this Measure 109 context. So the two things are running on different tracks at this point. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, beautifully. I have two more about the training. Is it okay, you guys, if I carry on with this one? So who establishes the curriculum? It looks like the state has essentially established the curriculum's content, and can you get access to them? But let's start with, it's the state that's writing it.
The state has set the architecture for the curriculum, and that architecture was derived from the Psilocybin Advisory Board and their subcommittee on training. But within that architecture of these are the elements, these are the essential elements that every training program must train to. Once those essential elements are met, training programs can go far beyond those essential elements and craft training to suit their vision and their desire of what training should look like. And so you could have a training program saying, we want to do an extra 100 hours on training facilitators and how to work with persons at the end of life, for example. And that might only be 2 or 3 hours in every other program's curriculum, but this training program might want to focus on that, as well as another training program might want to focus particularly on providing services to the LGBTQI community. So you can have training programs that are tremendously diverse from one another, as long as all of them meet the essential elements set out by the state. So the state is setting a floor, not a ceiling, to what needs to be trained to. So there's a second question.
Yeah, which I'll come back to, but can non-Oregon state training programs apply?
Yes, there is no, I believe, I need to look at this again. I don't believe there is a limitation on who can run a training program, but that is, I think, a little bit contentious and in flux unlike a service center where there has to be an owner that's a resident of Oregon.
Right.
A training program, I believe, can be out of state. That is yet to be tested at this point. But some of the training has to happen in state. So a training program will have to have some footprint in Oregon for practicum purposes, because at this point, Oregon is the only jurisdiction in the United States where a practicum could, in theory, take place. Yeah. And since there's a practicum requirement, you would need some footprint of a training program in the state of Oregon. Okay, whether that program is owned and operated largely out of the state, the rules, I think, permit that.
Thank you. And this is the last one on that topic from the floor. How can we access the rules for facilitators and service centers?
All of those rules are public. Yes. And so if you look at the Oregon Health Authority website, Oregon Health Authority under Measure 109 or Psilocybin Services Act, you will get to a page, and on one page of that website is listed everything that's happened under state authority with respect to Measure 109, including the rules that are published and the rules that are still in draft form. And there's links to everything, and they're all downloadable, and it's all very easy because it's all in one page. So all the language that I've been talking about at a very vague abstract level is accessible to you through the Oregon Health Authority's website.
Beautiful. So up to now, we've been going in great detail into the program in Oregon and how it's being designed. I have some other questions sort of bringing the Canada into it, but any other things from you, Mark, or you, Pam, about things that Daniel has talked about, or comments? Yes.
Have you done any financial modeling to even guess how much an individual experience will cost?
There has been some financial modeling done. I'm not privy to that modeling. I have not done the modeling. And so I'm not even going to hazard a guess to where that's falling out. I do know that there have been organizations and philanthropically minded organizations and individuals that are interested in figuring out how to subsidize the therapeutic experience for certain individuals or groups of individuals or communities of individuals. And I think that leads into sort of one more comment I would make before I pause, which is, what are some of the hurdles that we're facing in Oregon to standing this program up? And one is the equitable access based on cost to this medicine, because we just don't know what it's going to cost, but we suspect, because we don't have health insurance covering any of it, that there will be some major hurdles to afford this. The second question is, who is going to be excluded from accessing this simply because, or not, I shouldn't say simply, but because of their medical history suggests that psilocybin should be or is contraindicated for them. And so that is something that the state is still figuring out, who are the excludables from this program, and that's being written as we speak. And then the third issue is a political one. The state of Oregon and the majority of voters in Oregon passed this measure. However, the measure has a clause in it that allows localities to opt out of Measure 109. And so I think what we might see in upcoming months is
NIMBY.
We'll see some conservative communities whose voters did not support this in those communities, asking their city councils and their county councils to vote and put up a local referendum to allow them to opt out of Measure 109. So we might see this patchwork in Oregon of places where Measure 109 does not take effect because the voters have opted out from it taking effect. And so that's going to be another hurdle of figuring out, are there going to be places in Oregon that you just can't access it because the voters there don't approve of it and have chosen affirmatively to opt out? So let me pause there.
Wow.
I just have one more really quick question. Is it all individual, or is there group experiences as well?
Excellent question, Mark. It is individual and group, and regulations and rules are talking about and are being promulgated about what is the facilitator to individual ratio in group sessions. How many facilitators do you need per client in a group session? But it's absolutely, groups are allowed. The parameters of those groups are still being defined. But most of the discussion and most of the thinking in the public mind is still at the individual mindset. I think it'll be interesting to look back in 5 years, and maybe we will discover that group therapy is, for cost reasons and perhaps even for effectiveness reasons, really going to become the majority way that most of the people in Oregon choose to access psilocybin therapy, and not the individual. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch.
Well.
One of the conversations, just kind of on the modeling thing, because this is a really interesting question. We hired health economists to model out some of this stuff here in Canada, and there's pretty slim margins right now for the ketamine clinics in the U.S. Very slim, and many of them won't make it because of that unless they get covered by insurance companies. And so it'll be really interesting, given that psilocybin is a longer session. If the ketamine clinics can't really make a go of it, it really speaks to a good opportunity here for foundations and nonprofits and group therapy, and to really make sure that access is happening. So I think there's people that are thinking of jumping into the service center should think really hard about that. What is that going to look like, and what is really high quality therapy going to look like with good access in a model that is affordable.
I think that's exactly right, Pam. And I would add to that the other element to that discussion is just data collection. Not only around how much does each of these sessions cost and how long do they last, and how does the economics of it go, but what are the therapeutic outcomes for the individuals as well. And the issue of data collection, data crunching, and data dissemination is one that was really not well covered by Measure 109, is being made up now by the State Advisory Board, and is one that only is now getting some of the focus that it needs and deserves. And so without robust data collection and crunching and dissemination, this is a really lost opportunity. And so in the next several months, there's going to be public institutions in Oregon working with private scientists and researchers and outside people well beyond Oregon, all of whom are interested in this data question, trying to come up with ways to collect what's really going to be an incredibly robust data set, because Oregon is an entire state doing this with very few restrictions of who can access it. So if we're not able to collect the data, we're going to be losing out. I think everyone, Canada, as well as the rest of the United States, will be losing out. So fingers are crossed that we can collect and report out data in a timely manner.
I could just say from a perspective of who would not be eligible, any person that currently gives psilocybin to an individual would have, who knows what they're doing, would have found out what their medical history is and would know if they're on other medications and what's contraindicated and all of that, and wouldn't accept them as a client unless they were eligible from that perspective. And so I don't know if it's terribly complicated. You said that's one of the things you're looking at in Oregon, but that to me is part of like a training. It's just how that's what you tell people to do, how to
Sure. Well, the state has already come up with a list of conditions that should, at least at the moment, exclude people from immediate access to psilocybin. Those conditions can change, and so the person could return and seek access in the future. I don't have in my head what those limiting factors are, but Gillian, you raise a related and important concept that if you are a trained facilitator, that list that the state says are the reasons and causes for exclusion, you as a facilitator can expand that list based on your own personal experience and your training to say, this person in front of me, I do not feel comfortable in providing psilocybin to based on my professional judgment. And facilitators will have that authority in Oregon to say, yes, even though you might not be within one of those exclusion categories the state has defined, I, in my professional capacity, am choosing not to provide you this service for the following reasons. Right. And so they will have that authority, and hopefully they will be trained to exercise that authority appropriately.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move a little bit into where Canada is at, but one last question, Dan, from me, and that is, as far as I know, in Oregon, there's a very robust movement for the plant, for using the plant itself and not synthesized and not anything else. And
the fungi, Gillian.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, excuse me. Don't tell Paul I said that. Yes, the fungi. Yes. Sorry. I need to obviously take more lion's mane. And so is that an advantage? Does that create restrictions? Like where does that at with rolling?
I want to throw that question back to you, all the experts. Very early on, Oregon subcommittee on the issue of the actual product said, we are only going to use the natural plant, the fungi. We are not going to allow synthesized product at this point. That could change, but we're writing a rule now that says for now, only the natural product. And so that was a decision they made early on, and that's how Oregon is going forth. Whether you all think that's a wise decision or not, I'd love for you to weigh in on, but that's the decision Oregon has made, and that's what they're going with, and it'll be that way for at least a couple of years.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think They were more they even limited it down not just to psilocybin mushrooms. I think they limited it to psilocybin cubensis only.
That is correct. That
right?
is correct.
Yeah, so people won't have the option of like azarescence or semalanita or cyanescence, et cetera, et cetera. So just be
and that's not the law, that's a regulation, and regulations are more easily changed than a statute, so that can be changed. And we saw that in the medical marijuana context where things were loosened up, or in some instances tightened up through regulation over time. But you're right, Pam, that's exactly the limitation that Oregon put on very early on. And I'd be interested in people's reactions to how they think that should or will play out.
I personally think it's a great idea because I think it will really stimulate a pathway for the botanical drugs to be studied in the US. And the like there's only been two, I believe, I could be wrong, only 2 botanical drugs that have ever made it through the FDA. And I think if we have this kind of this medicine available in its whole form, that perhaps we'll start to see some clinical trials, and that could break open a lot of really interesting data on other botanical medicines that are coming through, you know, like ayahuasca or San Pedro or other things like that, to find how do we study the complexity of nature for medicines. And so I'm quite excited that that is where it's at. Because basically the 97 clinical trials registered right now at clinicaltrials.gov are all synthetic. And so we've got the data, we know it works, and I'd like to see the data around the mushrooms, and then we can start to tease out the intricacies of the complexity of nature. You know, which mushroom for which, what is more beneficial. You know, there's a lot of armchair folks out there that like to talk about, you know, what mushroom, like this one for this one for that, but I would like to see it more consistently, not based on people growing mushrooms in their bathroom.
And to present a counterpoint to that, Pam and I have had this discussion before. And in fact, it's funny because I think I agree on everything Pam has ever said, with this one exception. So the idea of the entourage, in fact, came along with cannabis because many people observed completely correctly that terpenes and the different types of cannabinoids did work well together and provide a whole experience that was better than any individual. But I look at what else is in a mushroom, baeocystin, norbaeocystin. Now I know, Pam, you will say that they provide some sedative effects that reduces anxiety. Personally, I think the precision that you can get from synthetic psilocybin in terms of dosing and by itself is actually a completely fabulous experience. I don't think the other things in mushrooms actually add anything to a pure synthetic experience that is way easier to dose. And for those folks who have argued against me by saying, but then the pure synthetic comes on much quicker, well, that's a formulation issue. And you can actually package it so it digests more slowly, so it does come on slowly and reduces slowly. So personally, I'm a synthetic guy.
But I mean, what I think here though is I don't think we're disagreeing. I think that there's room for both, and I think people should have the option for both. That if you do want the whole mushroom for the whole mushroom properties, you should have access to that. I just can't see why we can't do that. Like these can be grown very standardized. We can have standardized. We know what the level of the degradation is on the psilocybin. It's not an issue. So I think it's really kind of more of a choice issue. And you know, when I interviewed, Mark and I have already had this conversation, but when I interviewed our patients that had already gone through, had the option of having a synthetic psilocybin therapeutic session, and also had a mushroom therapeutic session, it was 100% favorable to the whole mushroom experience. And I agree that you can do all sorts of, you know, methylations or phosphorylations or deuterations or whatever to the molecule to change the properties of its onset and its offset. But I mean, damn, nature does it pretty darn well, and we're not exactly the smartest folks on the planet. So okay, but I think people should have choice. And I think the fact that if that mushrooms are there, and I'm just reiterating what I said before, I think it's going to open up some very interesting clinical trials, which are well overdue for full complexity substances that are growing on this planet.
Beautiful.
We agree.
Thank you. Okay, beautiful. Now, let's get to Canada. And this question has been sitting there right from the beginning. So now's the time boys and girls, and it's probably the time to talk about SAP, Special Access Program, and exemptions. How soon can Canadians reasonably expect to legally access psilocybin therapy safely and in a proper therapeutic environment?
You want to start, Pam, or shall I?
Yeah, oh, I can start and we'll fill it in together. We'll tag team this one. Well, right now, so Canadians will know, or that have been following this will know that previously, prior to January this year, we had the only access we had to psilocybin mushrooms or psilocybin at all was through this Section 56 exemptions, and a number of Canadians got those. And then the Health Canada was overwhelmed with applications and said this is not the way they want to deal with it. And so they've moved us into what is called the Special Access Program, which has existed previously. And I have used it many, many times as a physician. So as an illustration, if there is a medicine that is available in another country and has already gone through the regulations to be brought forward as a drug, I can apply to Health Canada under special access to say I would like this medicine for my patient in Canada, even though it's not an approved medication in Canada. And so that's the route we're in right now. So Health Canada is allowing SAP exemptions for these psychedelic medicines. So our program Roots to Thrive has received a number of SAP exemptions for synthetic psilocybin provided by Psygen, and others I'm told, and I'm checking into it, that have found it for the extract of psilocybin for their patients. And that's a different process. So that medicine must be GMP or probably CGMP certified. Good manufacturing practices is what that stands for. Has to be manufactured at a level that can be supplied to consumers. And then it also has to have gone through some safety and efficacy studies. And so we're in the very, very early stages of that. You know, this is a very long process to get through the clinical trials for an indication at certain dosages. But, you know, a lot of people argue that maybe we'll be in a situation of cannabis where, you know, cannabis was not legal. We were having a very difficult time getting through cannabis studies. And then the Supreme Court ruled, and then it was legal, or it was, you know, available for medical use. And so it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. You know, I think Mark's been in this much, much longer than I have. And, you know, I think things are moving at a speed, you know, quite a bit faster than I ever thought they would move on some levels. So we may turn a corner very, very quickly. And we may turn a corner of that it's legalized and we haven't done the clinical trials. And we don't have a clue what we're doing. Well, I mean, we have a clue what we're doing. I'm just saying, you know, published clue what we're doing. So anyway, so it's available through special access, through Health Canada, through right now it has to be an application from a medical doctor. So that is happening. Like I said, we've been able to do quite a few of these therapies through special access, and many other physicians across Canada have too. And that doesn't really answer the question, because I mean, how do we know? We need a government to legalize. Do you want to add more to that, Mark?
Absolutely. So it's interesting when the federal government announced a special access program, they explained their rationale in a multi-page document. And part of the rationale, quite unusually, was a long description of the support. The reason why they were doing it was so supported by the Canadian public, which is significant that they would actually say that in a document like that. And there's been a polling, Gillian is involved with a polling process through the Kidder group that has polled people across Canada for their support of psilocybin access, and specifically for death and dying. And a vast majority of Canadians support that. And politicians are aware. The only reason Justin Trudeau legalized cannabis is he read the polls. It was 56% of Canadians across the board supported cannabis legalization. And that's why he was elected, I believe, but it certainly didn't do him any harm. So the special access door is open with the recognition that it has wide support across Canada, which tests the political wind and gives potential voice for future politicians to speak about this stuff. And before everybody gets really excited about special access, I just want to reflect on the boxes that have to be ticked before Health Canada will say yes. So box number one is a very significant disease that's kind of described as an emergency, persistent and severe. They have to have tried everything else. It has to be the last ditch effort, and it can't derail a clinical trial. So that's important. So that means psilocybin is on the list. MDMA is also on the list. Now, curiously, what isn't on the list and what resulted in me having a conversation with Ian McKay, who runs the special access program, is training, because I believe there's a significant risk here if Health Canada doesn't understand the importance of providing context for psychedelic experiences. And so the training of the therapists who are involved, I personally think is really, really important. And so because training isn't a criteria for their approval, I had a long discussion with Ian saying, why not? And essentially he said, it's not their responsibility. That's the college's responsibility. Now, it's interesting, Pam and I have had some discussion, and colleges are not taking on that responsibility. So I see this as being a risk, to be honest, for our whole community. If people apply, so far, my understanding, and I've talked to them about, who not specific names, but who generally is getting accepted. And it sounds like people who are, quite frankly, involved with our community to some extent, who are getting approved. But I could easily see it expanding to people who, quite frankly, have no clue as to how to provide these experiences, and then things going wrong quite quickly. And so I think there's an area of vulnerability here. The special access door will only be open for a while. It will close after these things become legalized through the clinical trial process. But while the special access door is open, there is actually a vulnerability for all of us.
Can't we help them with that? Isn't that our role as the Psychedelic Association of Canada and MAPS Canada? Like, isn't that what they don't know? We can help them because we're trying to help them do their job properly, as well as bringing it to market, making it legal. Would they listen? Like, your conversation with Ian it's interesting, but did he say, well, that's a really good point, we haven't thought about that? Like,
no, he was really clear that
he
they had thought about it, and it's not their responsibility.
It's not their responsibility, yeah.
They test for credentialing, and I was trying to fit my arguments into the credentialing piece, saying, would this be included? And he was absolutely clear that it wouldn't be. So the credentialing means, if an oncologist asked for an ophthalmologist's special access drug, it's going to be refused because it really doesn't fit with their overall credentialing. But it's a very, very high level screening. And certainly, have you done the MAPS training or the TheraSil training or the whatever, the different training programs? That isn't part of his jurisdiction. And he was very clear about that.
Well, and that's also probably, they can't step into that because they're federal. And education is a provincial responsibility. So is medical licensing is a provincial responsibility. So, our Constitution stops them from even commenting on it because it's not their jurisdiction. So it will be a province by province.
Oh, Canada. Oh, Canada.
Well, the good thing is there's good education programs coming forward, and I think that will become the standard of practice. Like I said, here in British Columbia, we start this fall. We've got a great crop of people that have applied, like very skilled people. Ottawa will have the master's program launching next year. Again, it'll be and the nice thing about the Ottawa is it's also put in with the spiritual care. So it hits a different, so it's much like what Daniel was talking about in Oregon, is that there's an opportunity here for a lot of academic training to hit different areas. They hit different skill sets, different areas, different groups, and bring people right up from the very beginning of the training. Like you can anticipate, within a few years, we'll have people graduating from high school and starting their journey into psychedelic assisted therapy trainings.
And there's a wide range of those folks who would like to become psychedelic guides or facilitators or therapists. There's a wide range of training. There's tons of different organizations doing it, and they all offer something. Some are a little more academic, some are a little more experiential, some are a little more videotape watching based. There's just everything out there. And so if you were interested in this, I would explore all your options and really get a sense of the pros and cons of the different types of trainings. Generally speaking, my conclusion is they all offer something. And the trick is, how do we kind of get people a little more consistent in how this whole approach works?
We're down to the last couple of minutes. Any last comments or thoughts from any of you before I thank you?
I see a couple of questions from Jennifer, specifically around end of life and hospice care, and that's going to be an issue in Oregon. The way that the Oregon law is written, you have to be a service center as a provider. And it's pretty clear that most hospices will not apply to be service centers, in part because, as I said before, psilocybin is still illegal under federal law, and many hospices access federal funding in one sort or another. And so they would be in fear of losing their federal funding if they also jumped into bed with the Psilocybin Services Act. And so the way that the law is written is you can only access psilocybin therapy within a service center context, and most hospices will be precluded from becoming service centers. And so there will be a small portion of people who are confined to hospice who may not be able to access psilocybin therapy as the law is currently written. That could undergo legislative change in the future, but it would take that in order for that to happen. On the other hand, most people at the end of life are not in hospice, and most people in Oregon who reach hospice die in hospice within 2 weeks of getting, or even less, of getting to hospice. And so really the vast majority of people at the end of life who could actually benefit from psilocybin therapy will not be in the hospice context. They'll be in some other treatment context, but not hospice specifically. So there is some hope that service centers will be able to site themselves and to architecturally create themselves to be both accessible and inviting to persons with terminal illnesses short of hospice. And I think that will cover the vast majority of people in that category. So that's an excellent question, Jennifer. I think other jurisdictions that are looking at doing something similar to Oregon will draft it differently so that hospice can be a site where therapy can be given. But in Oregon, that's a little bit of a difficult situation.
Thank you.
One thing I would add is I think it's really important that we all really collaborate on this and learn from each other. You know, as Oregon's ahead, let's learn from them and let's see what they're learning, because there's so many unknowables here, and the more people that are involved in asking and lean in with solutions, like this is no time for people to be throwing punches or criticizing. It's about bringing solutions forward. We need solutions. We need a lot of bright minds. We need a lot of ways of looking at it in different ways. No one system's ever going to, hit everything and do it all perfectly. That's okay. That's called being a human. We are going to mess up and we're going to find things. And the more we collaborate, the better we're going to get. And so we can learn from Oregon, Washington process, we can learn from Colorado, we can learn from Vancouver decriminalizing. And so if you see something you don't like, bring the solution forward to wherever you're working. So I think that's really important, because we really do need to learn from each other and work together, because we're all in this together.
Mark?
You beautifully said, and I would like to applaud all of your leadership, because that's also a key ingredient to success. And you guys have been leaders for many, many years. I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So Dan, you have done a sterling job, because you're not feeling at all well today. And thank you for dragging yourself up from your sickbed to do this. We really appreciate it. It's very helpful. And there's a lot of interested people. Mark, thank you for just staying in there all these years in the drug policy reform world and the psychedelic wonder world, and just appreciate you all the time. And Pam, of course, my dear friend and colleague on the board, couldn't do it without you. I just want to remind everybody that you have been watching this as a result of the Psychedelic Association of Canada sponsoring this. We are available on our website at psychedelicAssociation.net. And we really encourage you to become a member if you're not already. And here's the kinds of people that you will join: people in healthcare, advocates, companies and organizations, members of the general community. And there are tons of benefits that you will get, including just hearing about all these new things that will keep you up to date. You can join our events for free. There's access to training opportunities if you're interested in that. You can meet the experts, access our curated resources, connect and network with others, which is probably one of the most important pieces. We're spread across this massive country, but we're all working together and just basically supporting the psychedelic movement. So I really encourage you all to join as a member if you're not already. Big thanks, big shout out to James, who makes this all work. I have no idea how he does it. And thank you, James, for all the hours that you put in as one of our volunteers. Thank you to all our volunteers. Thank you to our staff. And thank you to all of you for being here today.